everyone. Before I get started to talk about the policy and project disconnect, I just want to congratulate Carbfix for this really fantastic summit here. It's been really informative. Wonderful to be back in Iceland. I can't wait for the infrastructure site visits, and thanks everyone for your contributions. So when I saw on the agenda and got the opportunity to talk about project implementation, I was like, oh God, thank God, project implementation is on the agenda. It's really important. And then I was like, oh, well, what am I going to talk about? I'm from a climate NGO, Clean Air Task Force. We work on a range of technologies. The better part of my career I spent on carbon capture and storage policy, but now I run most of our international work. And so what I thought about was then, well, why don't I just talk about, instead of showing you all the great analysis that we have done, which many of you know, I'm just going to talk about what keeps me up at night. And what keeps me up at night is the policy project disconnect. So we passed a lot of wonderful policy, EU Green Deal, IRA, IIJA, billions of dollars in funding for carbon capture and storage projects, but really, the emissions reductions will only realize when we actually put the infrastructure in operation. So climate is an infrastructure problem, and we have to build our way to net zero. And what we're seeing already is that a lot of projects, first of a kind, we're so grateful for the brave project developers who are trying to figure it out, are struggling. I stole this chart from the Global Status of CCS report from GCCSI. Thanks, Chris and Lauren, who are here. And I really liked it because a lot of pieces obviously have to fall into place for a project to become reality. And it looks pretty simple on paper, right? 9 years, couple steps, here we go. But then I started annotating it, and I was like, whoa, what I'm hearing from project developers is like there's a lot of chaos as we're going through these steps. A lot of known unknowns, unexpected curveballs. And so I just wanted to point out that it's really, really important, as the Chris has said, we want to lobby policymakers, but we need to help policymakers understand what it really takes to realize these projects and gather feedback as fast as possible from this first generation of projects, over 200 only added in 2024, as we learned yesterday, and help policymakers improve policy as soon as possible. And so a couple examples here, right, what we're hearing is multiple parallel permitting process, different agencies, different permitting processes for multinational companies in different countries. Also, of course, we have a huge chicken and egg problem. We want to build CO2 transport and storage infrastructure. The timeline doesn't align with the carbon capture projects. We want to supersize infrastructure, but we don't have everything really perfectly lined up. And so what we're hearing from projects already, and this is really an invitation for those of you who are developing projects to approach us, tell us everything you're experiencing right now so we can take it back to policymakers. But what we're hearing is timing mismatch, right? Let's take, in the US, the CFIA program for CO2 transport and the CO2 storage program, right? These have, for the former, you need to have your permits and ducks in a row before you apply. The other one kind of disperses funding throughout different milestones throughout the process. So a mismatch that can make it really hard to align, to combine incentives. Process uncertainties. Yesterday, we learned from DOE over 100 Class 6 wells applications in, but then companies don't know, will we have a 60-day comment period, 90-day comment period, 180-day comment period? That can delay your FID, your commencement of constructions, by a long time, and that also costs money and makes it harder. Lack of standardization. I think on Wednesday there was a call with the EU about the Innovation Fund project. A lot of project developers mentioned CO2 purity standards, like if we're having supersized infrastructure, we want to use some of the CO2, store some other. If we mix industrial CO2, direct air capture CO2, how is it going to work out? So big questions that I think are creating real-time projects. Policy is static vis-a-vis macroeconomic realities, interest rates, inflation. A fellow think tank friend of ours calculated that actually from the $85 45Q, which is not indexed to inflation, $25 have already been erased or eroded by interest rate and inflation combination. That then makes it really hard for some of the first-of-a-kind projects to pencil out. My favorite one is perfect becomes the enemy of the good. So policymakers are like, well, we need to legislate for net zero, and they're putting a huge burden on project developers, right? Yesterday over lunch, someone in the room said to me, well, I think it's way harder to do a climate project than to do any other industrial project, even if that industrial project may create more emissions. An example is policymakers considering hourly matching of clean electricity as a requirement for direct air capture projects in grids that aren't clean. So somehow you're not only trying to commercialize the technology, all of a sudden you also have to clean up the grid before anyone else does. And then, of course, unintended consequences. My colleagues recently wrote a big blog on how Brexit actually made the UK storage unavailable for EU emissions, which is really unhelpful as we're seeing the UK actually issue more licenses to explore CO2 storage than anyone else. So this is what I call the policy project reality disconnect. Policymakers are not project developers, well, most of them. And so I think it's really on us as climate advocates to work with project developers to help translate. So we're making incremental improvements and are enabling learning by doing. Earlier we quoted solar or offshore wind commercialization. That was learning by doing, but that wasn't a perfect world from the start either. So I think it's really, really important that now where we have this first set of policies, the first set of projects, we really get down to how can we make this work and get these to across the finish line. So 3 things that I think that we can do, or governments can do. Number 1 is large-scale planning. The sooner we can understand what kind of infrastructure we need and where it goes, the more cost-efficient and land use efficient overall we can plan that infrastructure. It also allows us to get ahead and engage with community ahead of time, consider different possibilities. It also allows us to harmonize proactively and parse cross-border regulation, and of course, pre-permitting, planning of corridors. And this is, okay, well, I said I wouldn't show you our analysis, but here I want to. This is our CO2 storage analysis for Europe. It looks at 2 scenarios, 2035 and 2050. One is where we use a lot of CO2 storage that is local, which hopefully now is possible where a lot of the bans are being lifted, versus one where we really rely on CO2 export only for most countries that used to have bans. And of course, a middle ground is what will get us to a most land use, infrastructure, and cost-effective outcome. Here's another example of this. So if we just rely on the current storage sites versus have a combination of pipelines and suitable geology considered, the transport costs go down significantly. Number 2 is really reframing climate policy. There's a lot of this notion, well, we've done it, we passed it, we're done. But really, we've done a first iteration, almost like a first draft, right? Because now we're going out, we're building the infrastructure we need to deliver the emissions reductions. And so it's really important that we have this constant feedback loop and get policymakers comfortable with the idea that we might have to iterate on policymaking and to remove barriers. Other examples are really adjusting to market conditions, something that we missed out in some of the policies so far, and then putting in place common sense policies where we really have to find a nuanced trade-off between the perfect world and the incremental benefits from learning by doing, and of course emissions reductions. And then finally, I think I'd love to invite everyone in the room to help us identify no regrets actions. What can we put in front of policymakers that will make an immediate difference for projects to go ahead smoothly, reduce costs along the way, and that is something so we don't get down to the wire and have projects in limbo, so to say, as we're trying to figure out some of these policy obstacles, which we already know exist today. So my time is over. Thank you very much. This is an invitation. Be in touch with the Clean Air Task Force. Let us know how it's going, and thank you very much.